Okay, everybody, could we please take a seat and we can get started with our after lunch sessions. Our first speakers today are going to be Milica Vasiljevic and Mario Vike. Mario is a research associate. Milica is a research associate at Cambridge's Behavioural and Health Research Unit, and Mario is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Kent. Together, they've been doing some interesting work in behavioral decision-making, risk-taking, and other aspects of social and cognitive psychology, specifically how it relates to catastrophe modeling and the insurance industry. Cognitive bias can result in the misperception of risk across the market and can increase systemic risk. Milica and Mario have been doing some interesting work in this area in some reports titled Reasoning About Extreme Events, which was for the Lighthill Network, and Cognition Minding Risks by Lloyd's. And we really like the work they've been doing on cognitive biases, and we think understanding cognitive biases and how they how they interact with how models are built and how models are used is an important area for making models be used more effectively in the insurance industry and in thinking about systemic risk generally. So we're really happy to have them here with us. So please welcome our speakers.
Thank you so much. It's brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Just let me start this. Is it all up? All right, brilliant. So I came a little bit late, I'm afraid. Trying to swim over from Cambridge. Can I just have a little show of hands? So I would like to know who the audience is. So who's from Amlin? Who's kind of professionals here? Good. Okay, academics, more or less the other half. Psychologists, behavioral economics, economists, finance, kind of similar. All right, okay, good, interesting. Good, so what I would like to talk about first, bearing in mind the audience as well, is a noble idea. So then there's an idea that won a Nobel Prize, which is about decision-making that involve risks. So how do people make decisions when risks are involved? And that was work that was done by Daniel Kahneman. So I would just want to explain that to you a little bit and then move on from that to highlight a few areas where I think, well, it's time to make a step further than that and explain to you why we think this is relevant and what you can get out of that. Okay, and to start with, I would like to do a little exercise. So you have two options. So it was you as an audience. Two options, either A or B. You have to pick one of them. And option A, so there's a 3/4 of a chance to get £6,000. Yes, you can get £6,000. However, there's also a 1/4 of a chance to get nothing. Option B, can have £4,000 for sure. Okay, can I have a show of hands? So who takes option B? Okay, I would say that is the majority, £4,000 for sure. Who takes option A? A minority, those are the quants. Okay, so that was a
It's not a quant, it's a relative to the wealth.
it's a rational decision is a decision made by the minority. The expected value is the gamble in that case. £4,500 is the expected value for the gamble. However, most people avoided the gamble, highlighted here in red. We took the safe shot. Safe bet, £4,000. That's what we want to have. Okay, let's do that again. Option C or option D. Now C is slightly different. Now you can lose £6,000. 3/4 of a chance to lose £6,000. There's a 1/4 of a chance to lose nothing. Safe loss. £4,000 gone. Okay, who picks option D? The sure loss. Okay, you've learned. Very good. Who picks? Oh no, option C is the other one. Okay. Most people do pick option C. Why is that? Because we want to. No, I'm getting confused here. Most people do pick option C. Why is that? Because we want to take a gamble. We want to avoid the risk of losing £6,000. However, the rational choice is option D. So you have a 4,000-point loss, and you just take that. So. Based on, if you make a rational decision, you would take the option D. However, most people, they opt for option C, and they want to gamble, but there's a risk involved that you lose more. Okay, so basically what this shows us is not, oh, I'm not very good with those things here, sorry about that. Okay, so basically what this shows us, £4,000 winning or gaining £4,000 is not the same thing as £4,000 losing. So we want to take a gamble to avoid losing £4,000, right? However, when there's a gamble involved of gaining £4,000, we take the safe thing, we take the £4,000. Yeah, so the £4,000 gain is not the same as £4,000 lost. So basically that means, well, there's not a linear trend between how we value gains and losses. Yeah, so that it kind of goes this S-shaped curve. Okay, so but once we know that S-shaped curve and we can model it, we can describe people's decisions that involve those kind of risks, those kind of gambles, then we are good again, right? We know it's S-shaped, so we can model, we can predict the outcome of decisions. Then the question is, well, is it the case? Are our risk preferences indeed that stable? Yeah. And I would like to give you an illustration from some studies that we did in our own lab. So here you have two options. You can allocate tokens to two different funds. You have 5 tokens to allocate. Investment fund A, you get 10 times the amount invested, and you have a 20% likelihood of payout. Or investment fund B, 2.5 times the amount invested, but you have 80% the likelihood of a payout. Okay, for 5 tokens, you can put all 5 in investment fund A. You can put all 5 in investment fund B. Yeah, same choice for everyone. However, when reading this information, so this was done research with participants, when reading this information, just to make it look a bit nicer, there were some coins on the sheet for one group of participants. Just some coins. After all, it's an investment decision, so we put some coins on the sheet. Yeah, one group of participants. The other group of participants, exactly the same choice, so now the choice doesn't change, it's exactly the same choice, but now we put banknotes on the cover sheet, just to make it look nice. Completely contextual, has nothing to do with the decision. Does it affect people? That very contextual thing, does it affect people? Picture of some coins and picture of some banknotes? Of course, some people say, of course it does. So, it does, quite considerably. So you can see when there's a picture of the coins, people took the risky option, so the one with the low likelihood but a high payout, 30% of the tokens they put into that. And when there were the banknotes, almost 50%, went up 20%. Same choice, you just have some contextually, you present some coins versus some banknotes. And our risk preference, they change. What does this tell us about the stability of how stable those risk preferences are? Highly contextual. We do the same thing again. Now we don't show coins or banknotes. This time we ask participants who participate in that game to have different postures before they take part in the game. Some make a meek posture, enclosed, and some make an open body posture, confident body posture. 2 groups of participants. Who's going to invest more in the risky option? Again, there's a difference. Just this body posture for 1 minute changes people's preferences. In that case, we didn't do it with real money. However, there's other evidence that it affects. Actually, there's evidence that it affects. They've done it with people in the financial sectors as well. So with actual investors, and those investors, they read about, either they read about winning in a casino, or they didn't read the story about winning in a casino, and that was a completely different, the casino had nothing to do with their decisions, with the investment decisions. And then again, reading about winning in a casino made them have riskier investments, riskier investments. Okay, so risk perception is highly contextualized. It's construed in a given moment. Yeah, so yes, there is this, we can plot an S-shaped curve. However, it's perhaps not as straightforward as that. It changes depending on the context. And I think that's also quite important, rarely we make decisions in which we have all the outcomes specified for us. Yeah, so I asked you earlier, do you want to pick option A or do you want to pick option B? You have the likelihood given to you and you have the payout and everything given to you, so you make a choice. Well, that's not quite what we normally do. So oftentimes we maneuver in the dark. There's some uncertainty involved. We don't know the likelihoods, we don't know the outcomes. So how do people make decisions in those kind of contexts? Okay, and this brings us to the report that we were commissioned to write. This was a report that's entitled Cognition Minding Risks. So you can download it, you can look it up on the internet and download it. And this report was specifically targeted at tackling this issue, right? So when we don't have all the information given to us, how do people identify risks? How do they make risk decisions? And drawing on what we know in cognitive psychology as well as in social psychology, drawing on our knowledge of human behavior. Okay. And one of the things to look at, okay, how do people make those decisions? What do they come up with? We need to understand how attention works. How does attention work? And I'll give you an illustration. Some of you might know this already. So what I would like you to do is just watch that. There are two teams exchanging basketball passes. There's a team with white shirts and there's a team with black shirts. And your task is to count the passes of the white team. It's a little exercise. Just a show of hands, who has seen this before? Has been, okay, so, oh, quite a lot. So for those of you who haven't seen it, so just follow this very closely. It's kind of an attention task, so I would like you to monitor very closely what's happening and count the basketball passes of the white team, please.
How many passes does the team in white make? Go!
Okay, so answer? 13. 13 is the correct answer. Okay, those of you who counted, did you notice anything? And who don't know that already? Did you notice anything, those of you who counted? Haven't seen this clip before?
Didn't see the ball at the beginning.
You didn't see the, it's not a very good quality, I apologize for that. It's not the ball. I'll just continue playing this. So listen carefully.
The answer is 13.
13, yeah.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So if you do not pay attention, so attention is one of the mechanisms that you need to understand. If you do not pay attention, you can miss things that are right in front of you, right? And I'm going to give you a very, an illustration, another illustration here. Can you notice anything? This is a CT scan of a lung. Can you notice anything in that lung? Any chance? It's easier to see actually now that you're sitting a bit further away. Can you notice anything? Didier, you're nodding? A face? Similar to a face, there's a small gorilla, yeah, hidden in that CT scan. And again, this was a study that was done in this case with radiologists. They went through the CT scans of lungs of alleged patients. And so basically going slide by slide through those pictures, and the idea is, can you find early signs of cancer? Anything unusual that shouldn't be in this lung? And one of the, can you see it? Oh, it's difficult to see, I'm sorry. It's very easy to see when you look it up in the slides, actually. I'm sorry. Do we have lights, or I'll just proceed? I'll just proceed. Okay. Okay, it's very clearly visible. I'm sorry, it's just black what you can see here. It's very clearly. Oh yeah. Oh, very clearly visible. Okay, gorilla. Gorilla's hidden in those CT scans. Okay, just to give you the size of that, just in relation, the size of this gorilla hidden in a CT scan was about the size of 3 matchbox. An entire matchbox, that's about the size, the equivalent of that object hidden in the scan. What the doctors or the radiologists are looking for in that case are early signs of cancer. And those nodules have the size of about 3 match heads, so they're much smaller. And so the question is, okay, those radiologists, how many of the radiologists actually recognize that there's something wrong, there's an object in the lung that shouldn't be there? Do you have any guesses? 30%, that's not a bad guess. Okay, so here I plotted 12 in total. First one, didn't. 12. Two out of 12 recognized. There was in total a sample of 24. 4 out of 24 recognized that there's something going on. The others were looking at it, so they also had eye tracking. They were actually looking at the gorilla, but they didn't see it. Nothing. So because when they weren't attending it, they weren't looking for a gorilla, which obviously shouldn't be there. Okay, so now you can ask yourself, now if you're doing your complex scenarios, you have data sets, etc., you have complex environments, how easy is it to miss something important in there that perhaps shouldn't be there? It's very easy if you don't attend to it. Okay, so what determines our attention? So attention is important. What determines our attention? One of them is expectations. So experts tend to have more realistic expectations. Experts are usually better at knowing what are the risks involved and what's the size of the risk. However, it's not always. Sometimes experts can have false expectations, and in particular in situations when there's no feedback. In order to have good expectations, you need to have a feedback loop. If you don't have that feedback loop, then your expectations may be false. And you find that underwriting cat risks, when exposure increases, or in the London, this excessive loss spiral, people were just underwriting, kept keeping on underwriting risks, underwriting their own risks. Exposure increases, and there's no feedback. You don't know that you're more exposed. Another thing where expectations can be misleading is risk dependencies. So here's an example. El Niño can lead to floods in California, declined fish stock in parts of Southern America, greater dryness in Australia, and they're causing wildfire. So you have those dependencies between risks, and they often catch people. They are unexpected. It's very difficult. So this is something that comes out of unexpectedly. Social amplification is a very important concept. So this was done by research by Gerd Gigerenzer. What they did is they extrapolated from the road accidents in the US past 9/11. What's the expectation? Interstate highways, how many road accidents would we expect? And how many did we observe after 9/11, after terrorism attack? Yeah, and doing those kind of calculations, they found out, well, actually, 1,500 people died after 9/11 on the road that shouldn't have been dead. They were avoiding, they were responding to the terrorism attack, swapping airplanes for another mode of travel, going on interstate highways with their cars, dying in their cars. And so that's kind of social amplification, which is something that often becomes unexpected and is something that's very important for us to model as well. And risk models. So of course, when we're modeling risks, the outcome of those models, that also guides our expectations. That's what we attend to. And things that fall outside, that might come unexpected. Okay, context-dependent risks. So we have cultural and social priorities. This is an example from a tribe in Africa where the tribe is particularly concerned with two types of risks. One is flu, and the other one is being struck by lightning. It's not that exposure is greater. It's not that there's more lightning going on in Africa or anything of that sort. It's because it's culturally transmitted. It's a social construct as well. So that determines where people attend to the kind of risks that we attend to culturally. So terrorism was still an unnamed peril after the first significant terrorism attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. It remained an unnamed peril and was underwritten as such. And then insurance industry made a huge losses afterwards. Okay, other things, other types of context. So we tend to focus on things that we find easier to understand, where we can establish thresholds. So for instance, as research with insurance companies, what are the types of risks that bring insurance companies down? their greatest risks, as it were. If you look at actual insurance company failures, there have been analysis of that. What are the risks? It's operational risks. Those are the biggest risks that actually can lead to insurance company failures. But, and as argued in this report, operational risks actually do not receive that much attention as a type of risk. It's usually other types of risks. Why is that? Well, what we do, we have the tendency to focus on areas that are easier to grasp, easier to understand, and to establish thresholds. So this is a very simple example. Two tubs here filled with ice cream. One is a large tub, it's underfilled. The other one is a small tub, it's overfilled. Which one are people more willing to pay for? The overfilled one, even though, absolutely speaking, it has less ice cream. Why? Because this relative judgment is something that's easy for us to do. Relative size, we can judge easily. Absolute size, it's very difficult for us. And there's an example here, absolute levels of risk. Radiation, Fukushima. There's low level of radiation entering in the US. Low level of radiation, absolute. What does it mean? What's a low level of radiation? Oxford, that's background radiation in Oxford. That's what we're exposed to. What exactly does that mean? Absolute levels. It's very hard to grasp for us. Well, perhaps it's comforting it's slightly higher in Chernobyl. 3.74. However, when we are on an airplane, 2.2. So we're still exposed to great levels. So we kind of need to, we're always trying to make this comparative judgments. We need thresholds. And we focus on contexts and areas where we can establish those thresholds easily. Decisions are not made in isolation. Financial markets are social markets. There are market players. If you've ever been exposed to the market environment, it's a social context. There are norms, there's reputation, there are all sorts of things involved, and of course they guide how people do things. So this is an example from a famous study. Participants in this case, they had to compare lines, and they were sitting in groups, and unbeknownst to the actual participant involved, everyone else in the room was a collaborator. And the task was very simple, so to say which one out of the 3 lines to the left has the same size as the comparator on the right. A, B, or C. Okay, it's a clear-cut answer, right? However, as the study progressed, all the collaborators, they were giving the wrong answers. They were saying A, perhaps a C, A. When it came to the actual participant, well, A. Right? So, overwhelming number of participants, they just went with the norm. What everyone else was saying, they didn't speak up. And it was just an experiment where there was no reputation as such involved, no relationships. People came together ad hoc to make that kind of judgments. And now you think about when people make decisions in financial markets where they have this kind of history and social relationships. Power is another one. I've been doing quite a lot of research on power. Power affects the same, risk perception as well. Usually it diminishes perceptions of risk. So people who feel powerful, they are more inclined to take more risks. Yeah. So number of CEO stock options correlates with the extent to which oil and gas companies engage in risky projects, for instance. Not always. If you're the head of health and safety, then it's your job to watch out for health and safety. So you're not going to be taking undue risks. But just to illustrate the extent of this here, this was done a study where participants, again, they came to the lab, they were made to feel powerful, or they experienced an instance of powerlessness, and then they estimated the number of fatalities across different types of hazards. You can see the difference is a whopping difference. When people feel powerful, they estimate about 10,000 deaths. When they feel powerless, they estimate about 30,000 deaths. Just, people coming in the lab and just giving them a brief exposure to being in power or being powerless. Another type of risk where I've been doing quite a bit of research is planning, future planning. There are always risks involved in future planning. And a lot of times those plans are overly optimistic. So people are very, very consistently underestimating the time it takes to do things. If you have ever been involved in a software project, you know what I'm talking about. And this is reinforced or strengthened, this bias is strengthened when people feel powerful. So if this feelings of power increases as risk, you oversee, you overlook the kind of impediments, all the things, the meticulous things that may go wrong, things that are involved, and as a result, you err more in your predictions. Okay, what else? Different types of perspectives, temporal bubbles. If I ask you perhaps now, what are the real key environmental risks? Flooding. If I asked you, perhaps in the summer when there's a drought, and this summer there's not going to be a drought, but we did have droughts not too long ago, and it's drought, right? So we kind of live on those temporary bubbles that perhaps they encompass days, weeks, perhaps months, but they are not extended very far. And that again, that determines what we attend to, the kind of risks we attend to. Another type of perspective is whether things are perceived abstractly from a distance or concretely from very close. Distance, perhaps happening in Somerset or perhaps somewhere else in a different country in the world, doesn't affect us, so we perceive things very in the distance. However, a flood on your doorstep, knocking on Westminster, that's going to be something very concrete. That's visceral. It elicits different images. So people they estimate the risks being greater. And to give you an illustration of that is how much people are willing to pay for different types of insurances that are either very abstract or that highlight concrete hazards. So on the top you can see hospitalization covers. Yeah, so how much are people willing for hospitalization? Any disease, any accident, any disease about $90 in the study. Any accident is about $70, so it's kind of mutually exclusive. Any reason, $40. Now, of course, any reason encompasses the more concrete ones. However, this is something people get worried about. It's something very concrete. Yeah, and so as you become worried about it, this is something you attend to. You overestimate the risk, and you're willing to pay more for insurance. Flight insurance, the same thing. Different types of protection. Any acts of terrorism, $14. Any non-terrorism related failure, $10. Any reason, $12. So again, the abstract event attracts less. It doesn't affect us that much. It's more of a distance. Okay. In conclusion, to stick to my 25 minutes here, what I try to show you and what I hope you can take home with you as well, I think humans, they play a critical role in systems, whether it's financial markets, it's the underwriting market, ecosystems, there are humans involved in all those things. People ultimately are the ones who oftentimes make the decisions and determining what's happening in the system. And it's very important to understand human behavior and cognition. It's a challenge. It's not very easy, as you could see, but it needs to be addressed in order to tackle the kind of global challenges that we face. All right. Thank you.
Take Mario's talk a bit further and actually talk about behavioral biases in the identification of catastrophe risk in particular. Okay, so I'm going to start off by giving you a conundrum. So this is known as the Texan Problem. So if I tell you that Tex is a Texan and 90% of Texans are rich, what would be the probability that Tex is rich, actually? Any guesses? Exactly, it's 0.9 or 90%, so quite easy. Okay, so if I take this problem further and actually tell you that Tex is a Texan philosopher and 90% of Texans are rich and 10% of philosophers are rich, and if I ask you the same question, what is now the probability that Tex is rich? Any guesses? So it's interesting because when there are insurers in the audience, they're always willing to actually calculate the probability. So actual formal statistical models do not provide a definite answer to that question. And the Texan problem is known as a reference class problem, and actually explains these observations that can belong to different classes and categories. So text belongs to two different distributions, being both a Texan and a philosopher. And those distributions actually give us different probabilities of him being rich. And actually coming to a solution to this problem is actually quite difficult, because statistics doesn't give us a ready answer. And this is especially difficult for extreme observations, such as catastrophe risks. So human judgment is actually needed to combine the evidence from these different sources and distributions. And actually, people can perform this conundrum quite well, and similar judgments like this. And people are actually pretty good at using their intuition and then combining it. However, as we just saw in Mario's talk, people can fall prey to systematic errors, especially when judging rare and extreme events such as cat risks. And experts are also affected. So I'm going to summarize some of the conclusions we actually made in the report that we did for the Lighthill Risk Network and the ESRC, which actually talks about how we reason about extreme events and the behavioral biases behind cat risks understanding. So one of the biases that we talk about in our report is the availability heuristic. So we know that people respond more strongly to risks that are salient to them. So perhaps because there's lots more coverage of it in the media, or something is happening, such as the floods, the recent flooding. So recent disasters can actually lead to the overestimation of a catastrophe reoccurring. And important examples from the insurance industry have been such as the Loma Prieta earthquake. So before the Loma Prieta earthquake, up to 34% of Californian residents said that they don't actually need coverage for earthquakes. After the Loma Prieta earthquake, so post-1990, this figure dropped from 34% to only 5%. So because there was this salient disaster, they were more willing to mitigate against it. Another example from the insurance industry is, again, the unwillingness of people to actually fly post 9/11, but also the unwillingness of insurers post 9/11 to actually underwrite terrorism risks. And another example is post Hurricane Andrew, the hike in prices that went up in the insurance industry. However, there are also certain caveats related to the availability heuristic. So it's not always that we overestimate something that has recently happened, that it will happen again. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question again. Which outcome do you think is more likely if we tossed a fair coin at the moment? So we have outcome A, and you have the option of having a tail, 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 tail 7 times, or B, having a head, tail, head, tail, head, tail. Which one is more likely to happen? They're equal, right? But many people actually believe that A is less likely to happen because they believe that it's less likely that the same event will repeat again and again and again. And this is the futility of people who believe that actually, the rain will stop tomorrow because it has rained enough. Okay, so this is known as the gambler's fallacy, whereby people actually underestimate the probability of a repetition of an event that has just happened. And this might have happened to George Osborne when he was saying with certainty that a double dip is not a hit, and then it did actually happen.
No, it didn't. Actually, it turned out from the data that there wasn't a double dip.
Well, or close enough.
Close. Close. No cigar.
And a similar actually bias related to the availability heuristic is the mean reversion bias, which assumes over time that the trend will return to the mean, okay? And this is actually a futile belief, because if we actually look at the 1 in 100 and 1 in 500 year events, such as the century floods that hit Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, actually we know that actually this is a futile belief. that things will return to the mean. Okay? So another bias that we talk about in our report is small probabilities, and we actually discussed this paradox of small probabilities. So in behavioral science, there is a long-standing assumption that actually rare events are always overweighted. But actually, this is not true. And there are some instances where actually small probability events, such as catastrophes, have been really unduly underestimated or underweighted, and these are now known as black swan events. So what we were really interested in is actually, can we predict when these biases are likely to occur, knowing things about human cognition? So it actually seems to be that rare events tend to be overweighted when probabilities are explicitly specified. And this seems to be related to the availability heuristic. So things become more salient in people's mind. And of course, this salience leads to more visceral emotional responses, okay? So one good example is the Dick Cheney's response to the 9/11 attacks in saying that the likelihood of 1% of a terrorist activity must be treated as a certainty. On the other hand, we also know that small probabilities can be underweighted, and it seems to be that they are underweighted when decision makers rely on their personal experience to estimate the likelihood of rare events occurring or reoccurring. And really good examples from the insurance industry have been the Bhopal accident. So prior to 1984, many chemical companies actually could not believe that a disaster of such magnitude could happen, so they didn't actually mitigate properly. And another salient example is, of course, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, after which insurers actually still underwrote terrorism risks as an unnamed peril and lost post 9/11. Okay, so then we turn on to temporal biases. So Mario touched upon this. So one of the biases that we talk about is discounting. So people seem to have basically value delayed rewards much less than anything that happens at the present time. So insurers of catastrophe risks need to trade off the immediate cost of reinsurance against the future potential gain if the insured event occurs. So the cost, as we heard, actually is much more painful to them than this potential gain in the future. And one salient example comes from Katrina and the example of the risk mitigation. So just about 2 months before Katrina, they had a simulation evacuation exercise, and they actually found that their evacuation wasn't working properly, and they needed to actually improve their evacuation plans. And they thought, oh, well, what shall we do? How shall we do it? And they deferred it to the future and actually did nothing, even though they knew that they were coming into a storm season, and they knew what the likelihood of probable losses will be if a disaster of the magnitude of Katrina happens. So they actually deferred their changing it to later, and then obviously suffered. We also discussed planning myopia, which is the tendency to consider consequences over a too restricted time horizon. So thinking about the insurance industry, one really good example is the actual, within the next 20 years, it's projected that California will gain 10.2 million people coming into California, and that is like the entire state of Michigan moving into California. Okay, and this is very, very rational and seems to talk about this planning myopia of people, because actually within those 20 years, there's a 62% probability that there will be at least one 6.7 or greater quake in those 20 years. So it is really, really rational, and it seems to be talking about this inability of people to think about the larger horizon. We also talk about the loss aversion of people, and especially insurers. As Mario mentioned briefly in his talk, people are much more aware of losses, and they actually feel those losses much more than an equivalent gain of the same size. So one good example from the insurance industry is that insurers charge considerably higher premiums for catastrophe risks compared to other non-specified risks. So if we actually, they actually did give people different cat risk and other non-specified risk with the same amount of probability and the same specified loss. And of course, the insurers always specified a higher premium for the cat risk. And this is because of this visceral response and not wanting to lose more with the cat risk. But of course, it's not rational. There are, of course, also related biases to loss aversion, such as the status quo bias, which is the preference for things to stay the same. And one good example is, for example, organ donation. So people always do whatever is the default. Another bias is the sunk cost bias, which actually talks to us about when costs incurred in the past are used as a justification to continue investing in suboptimal projects or strategies in the future. So Mario talked about computer projects, but the Concorde is one excellent example of this. Another bias that we also look at is anchoring. So the pricing of premiums goes through a chain of anchoring and adjustment, actuaries, underwriters, reinsurers, and it is extremely important to know the initial expected value and how prices have been adjusted. And the final bias that we actually talk about is the hindsight bias, which actually impedes people's learning. So after an event has occurred, people believe they knew the outcome of the event before it actually happened. And this bias is really, really bad because actually it hampers people's ability to learn from others. So this is a picture from Hurricane Wilma. So this was straight after Katrina happened, and of course residents of Wilma were warned that a hurricane is approaching. However, many of them decided to do nothing because actually in the previous 2 years there had been 7 false alarms. And this reinforced their learning that actually in hindsight nothing was happening. And this is very easy with catastrophe risks in particular to think, oh well, they don't happen so often, so I don't need to mitigate. But this is actually very painful because it also dampens the motivation of people to learn from others. And there was a really striking example in the literature in the laboratory where they actually trained people to learn how to mitigate and insure against hurricane risk, so the optimal level of insurance. And what they found was actually people were very slow to learn, so they weren't learning when other people around them were making losses. They only adjusted their level of investment after they suffered a loss themselves. Okay, so this can be very painful. In our report, we also talk about catastrophe modeling. So of course, we can see that human judgment seems to be plagued by these cognitive biases. So we can say, well, actually, maybe catastrophe modeling is the answer. Well, actually, we do say that human judgment is actually part of the process of modeling extreme events, and we need to be cautious at how we are actually understanding these models. So there are several sources of uncertainty, especially when modeling catastrophe events, such as how unknown parameters or missing data were handled. What about the varying data quality? So we know that some geographic regions, such as the USA, has better knowledge of hurricane risk than Japan, for example. What are the distributions that are used to model the events? So does the Poisson, the negative binomial, give us a different prediction? And of course, in terms of cat risk modeling, those models always use tails, extreme ends of distributions, and we need to be careful about how we're thinking about these models, obviously. So there have been intervention techniques in the literature that have tried to actually ameliorate some of these biases that I have been talking about. And one of those interventions is considering alternatives. And people have been shown to get better at identifying catastrophe risk when they consider alternatives, so they start thinking more systematically and rely less on heuristics. But again, this is not a silver bullet. Again, increasing the incentive structures seems to be improving decision making sometimes, but not always, and it doesn't ameliorate all biases. Group decision making can serve as an error checking system and also increase the level of expertise. However, this can also lead to other cognitive biases, such as groupthink or power and status relations, which may actually bias the decision making process. Statistical training has also been tried in ameliorating these biases, and we know that actually training people in simple statistical rules can actually help them ameliorate some of these biases, however, not very complex. We can't actually teach people complex rules such as Bayes' rule, so this doesn't seem to work. And what it seems to be from all the recent research in interventions, it does actually come out that there is no silver bullet for all biases, and all these interventions have been studied in isolation and in other contexts away from the insurance industry. So what we identified is a few gaps and future directions. So there seems to be a paucity of frontline research, especially in the insurance and reinsurance industry. And quantification of these biases in real-life settings is very difficult, and many of these examples seem quite anecdotal. So there needs to be more frontline research. And behavioral insights seem to be relevant for both reinsurers and beyond. And obviously, a closer collaboration between academia and the industry seems to be coming out of this report. Thank you. So I'll ask Mario as well.
Okay, so we'll take some questions now for 10 minutes. So. All right, here first.
Yeah, I would have many. I'm very critical, actually, of the, let's say, classification of this bias and things like that, because, I mean, I was just listening in real time of all your lists and so on, but they are addressing problems out of a real life context and also trying to go to the atomic structure of this bias, while in many cases I know and I can cook up and I can study that there are several actually entangled explanations. So there is not such a thing like when you take a decision in a vacuum. Even the clear-cut experiment that you report, and this is my fundamental critique about all the experimental work in economic decision-making, is the fact that in reality you have many prospects in your mind, many situations and so on, and the difficulty is to actually make relevant this simplified approach. So I think a fundamentally new approach, much beyond what has been done in experimental economics or decision-making, is needed to be relevant. So just to give one thing, I mean, I have so many critics, but one is even the simple example, the simple one I can imagine, where you were showing the set of tell versus one which look more random. And you say, of course, we know it's a fair coin, and what is more probable is 50-50, while most people would say tell, let's say following the tell. Actually, we know that, I mean, if I don't trust you, if I have many reasons to think uncertainty and so on, which is the real situation in the real world, which is the situation when I'm a hunter-gatherer, which I've inherited these processes, which is, I mean, the case where uncertainty is prevalent, then of course, without any, and it depends a lot on the incentives, if there's no cost for me to be wrong, and so many piling of criticism that I can think of in terms of exploiting this insight of economic, of decision theory to the real life. Try to defend now.
Shall I start?
Yeah,
Have you read Alan Greenspan's latest book? and he was talking about, so what happened, what went wrong with the financial crisis. So he's anti-regulatory, and he was looking into it very carefully, and it's quite an insightful piece of writing. And so he says, well, ultimately, what we were assuming all the time is, those human fallacies. Yes, we know they exist, but how are they really relevant? Context change, so hence, perhaps those errors are just random. They're randomly distributed, and as long as those errors are randomly distributed, they shouldn't affect the system. So we do not care about them. And if you look at how people do experiments, it's in very constrained settings. However, what we know now, and this is something that was a challenge for a long time, but what has become transparent over the last couple of years, is that actually those individual biases that you can observe with those kind of simple tasks, they can transcend to the collective, to the markets, and a kind of leap that had to be made was something that people assumed. They talk of bear markets and bull markets. People resort to psychological explanations all the time, in particular when things go wrong. And when people talk about confidence in the market, optimism in the market, people are pessimistic. It's something that politicians care about. So if no one cares about it, at least politicians, they want to know well-being. Are people optimistic? I mean, so many policy decisions, they're made on the basis of, let's not scare the markets. If that is not relevant in no psychology, then I'm not entirely sure. So my answer would be, yes, I can see where this is coming from. And I think the crucial point is whether it really affects the collective on all those individual biases. And yes, it does. It has been shown to transcend to the collective. And also, what we want to do is not just be descriptive. So we can have mathematical models of bubbles and crashes. So then we can describe that. And we can perhaps predict with some probability, does it reoccur or not. However, we do not understand it. We do not understand fundamentally the workings of it. We talk about correlations, etc., and so forth, but we do not understand exactly what are the mechanisms behind it, who is pulling the trigger, essentially. And I think this is something that behavioral insights can give you, so we can get a much better understanding. If you do that, we can apply it to different contexts. So then I can say, well, perhaps your model that applies in one context, but it doesn't apply in another, because, for instance, we only see it occurring when people have the opportunity to influence one another. So perhaps it only works in settings where people come together and they observe other people making decisions, etc. So I think there has to be more than just being descriptive. There has to be something about explaining mechanisms, and we can take that and apply that to different settings as well.
Could we take another question?
I would like to amplify Didier Sornette's point as to the relationship of this with the real world, because I'm a modeler, I'm a catastrophe modeler. So I mean, as soon as I hear your examples about giving you an option of taking a 20% probability of winning or losing, I mean, the real world, that 20% is never known. It's an estimate. It's going to be based on someone's model. And so the first thing, and if you tell me there's a probability of achieving 10 times return, that's going to be based on someone's model. So to take it out of the context of model into absolutes is sort of meaningless. It actually isn't. The real world is not like that. And if ever anybody tells me, here's an experiment where you have a 20% probability, I know that 20% will be the result of some modeling exercise, and I'll want to know what it's based on. Is it empirical? Is it statistical? Is it based on some historical time series? I mean, that's the fundamentals of modeling, of risk modeling, of catastrophe risk modeling. And it seems to me you're living in a parallel universe.
Let me add on this, just 30 seconds, if you allow me. You were criticizing the insurance not to provide insurance after 9/11. You mentioned this. It's super rational, actually.
In hindsight, you are suffering from hindsight bias. You are in your analysis. Because in hindsight, the risks were more or less stationary. It seems stupid 10 years later not to have offered. But on the heat of the thing, not knowing, let's say with not enough information and
Certainty of what was happening
happening with Al-Qaeda, with the belief that they were super organized. It was very rational, actually, with this uncertainty to make this. But you are suffering yourself from the hindsight bias by making this conclusion.
Can I just answer the first question? Well, the second question, because I think let's come back to that. But I think that one we are in perfect agreement. In fact, it was the starting point for the talk. The talk that I gave was that saying, well, actually, that's not how we make decisions. Normally, probabilities are not given to us. If you remember that slide, and that was the point where psychology comes in. We need to go beyond what is normally studied in behavioral economics. So normally in behavioral economics, you have those kind of trade-offs. Do you pick A or do you pick B? No, we need to look beyond that. What happens in decisions where people do not know the probabilities or do not know the outcomes? And that's exactly the starting point for our report, and that we worked together with Lloyd's, the first one that you saw. So I think we're not in a disagreement at all. And so, but I definitely think that behavioral science has something to say about how people act or make decisions in those circumstances when you do not have probabilities given to them, and the kind of mistakes they can make. And we all know that there are mistakes happening. Everyone I talk to, normally, I mean, if you talk to people on a private level, everyone admits that there are mistakes. People know that. So, and I think psychology has something to say to that. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, just to add again that actually all these decisions which seem rational, well, actually it is the knowledge of these cognitive biases which need to actually highlight that humans are not rational beings and the decisions that we make are irrational. And actually we need to move beyond this notion of rationality and that everything is rationalistic, and whether I'm getting this clear.
Okay, we have time for one more question, if anyone wants to. Yeah.
Would it be fair to summarize by saying that, we're all somewhat irrational and somewhat rational, but sometimes in the real world it can be rational to be irrational. So you need to be a bit cautious in applying these insights directly from the behavioral lab to the real world. But clearly the phenomena that you're studying are very important in the real world. They just may manifest themselves in rather different ways from the ways they manifest in the laboratory.
Well, of course, there will be differences between the real world and the laboratory, and I think that's one of the notions that Didier is saying, well, you're studying this in the lab, and of course it works in the lab, but there are so many other things, you're taking it out of context, and hence you're getting these effects. But actually, I think that people in the real world often forget about these contextual differences and these cognitive biases that even taken out of the lab happen. So people need to think about these cognitive biases. So I think it is a fair summary, but thinking about these biases may help actually and aid decision making. So just thinking that the model, the catastrophe model that one gets is perfect, actually doesn't seem to be the answer. Otherwise, we'll just have all these wonderful models and we'll know everything. But actually, there is lots of human decisions related.
Can I just add that the basis for financial markets, efficient markets, a market hypothesis. It is based on the idea that market actors, they are rational and they have access to the information that they need to make a rational decision. And so that is something that's kind of a guiding principle that underlies the whole idea of liberal markets and liberalization, having no regulations, etc. And so it also affects government policies, that kind of idea. So I think it's quite important you're already saying, you're acknowledging it. You're saying, oh, well, okay, is it fair to say we're making those mistakes, but nevertheless things kind of...
We have no further time for questions, so please thank our speakers.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay. I guess we're going to be dealing with some microphone stuff for a second. So let me just start by introducing our next speaker. Gordon Wu studied mathematical physics at Cambridge, MIT, and Harvard. And when I was doing background research on him for this introduction, I had heard an amusing story from the Financial Times. He was the only person they'd ever met who had catastrophist written for his job on his business cards. He's the author of a book which we found very interesting called Calculating Catastrophe, which examines a diverse array of catastrophic risks, from things like geomagnetic storms to terrorism, where he's done some notable early work. Gordon Wu is the chief scientist at Risk Management Solutions. Risk Management Solutions is the largest of 3 major vendors that provide catastrophe models that are used in the insurance and financial industries. And due to the connections between catastrophic risk, systemic risk, and the modeling of the systemic risks of modeling, we're very excited to have him here today to speak with us. So you're still getting the microphone ready, so just bear with me for a second.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had the honour of being interviewed by James Martin about 10 years ago. Nobody who's ever met James Martin would ever forget him, and here I am speaking at the Oxford Martin Centre, and it's a great sort of honour for me to be standing here today, and I'd like to dedicate my talk to his memory. The title of my talk is Catastrophe Risk Modelling and Financial Crashes. I'd like to start with this slide here, just showing that in the popular media, there are constant references to natural hazards whenever there's a downturn in any of the financial markets. So we have the terminology of the financial tsunami, an earthquake in the financial markets, a financial hurricane. This is a quote here. There is no crash at the moment. Only a slight premonitory movement of the ground under our feet. This is a quote from the mid-19th century, and it's a quote directly from the Bank of England. There's no crash at the moment, only a slight premonitory movement of the ground under our feet. And for anyone who's come from outside Britain, this is not a country where tremors occur that often, so this was a financial crash. There is a field of study called catastrophe science. It's not widely appreciated that there is such a field, catastrophe science, which I've reviewed in my book, Calculating Catastrophe, and it covers man-made perils and also natural hazards. And of the man-made hazards, there are financial crashes, which is the theme of my talk here this afternoon. The person who really stands out in this whole discipline is Bernard Mandelbrot, and it's well known that he was one of the first to draw attention to the fat tails in the financial markets. What is not that well known is that it was actually Mandelbrot, who was essentially a mathematical scientist, not a seismologist, who first helped to understand why it is that the occurrence of earthquakes follows a certain type of pattern in terms of the magnitude frequency. And it's due fundamentally to the fact that if you look at this photograph here, it's not possible to tell just by looking at it what the scale of it is. These could be small pebbles or large rocks. And it was Mandelbrot, in fact, who first pointed out that through the whole concept of fractals, that the magnitude-frequency relation of seismology, first phenomenologically derived by Gutenberg and Richter, that this could be understood. So I work for a company, Risk Management Solutions. In terms of risk management, for any type of catastrophe, we can ask the following questions. Is the root cause of the failure due to the managers themselves, i.e. the individuals who just got it wrong on the day? This is from Hurricane Katrina. That's the Tohoku tsunami of March 2011. And of course, we had the demise of Lehman Brothers and the great financial crash. So is it basically a problem with the risk managers? Or is it the kind of practice that they followed? Or perhaps more worryingly, is it the actual strategy which is wrong? Is it the managers to blame? Is it the actual practices which they followed? Or is it the underlying strategy which is to blame? And I hope to shed some light on this question during this talk. Just to start with some very basics of fund management, we have this basic equation for the growth of a fund over time, where we have a rate of return R, we have an inflow and a withdrawal from the fund. And if one takes this as being the basic equation we're trying to look at to understand catastrophe risk, then we can start with looking at the experience of earthquake insurance loss in California from 1971 up to 1992. Now, 1971 was a seminal year in California because it was the year of the Great San Fernando earthquake, which had a big impact on the building codes in California. So if you were an insurer looking at this histogram here, you say, well, the building codes were upgraded in 1971. We had this bad earthquake in 1989, Loma Prieta in Northern California, so optimistically you could hope that perhaps that was a fair sort of depiction of what the hazard looked like in California. And the highest loss ratio there from the Loma Prieta earthquake was just a bit above 120%. Well, of course, nothing in this histogram, nothing would have prepared an insurer for the loss ratio in 1994, which was 2,272.7. And basically, this was the kind of earthquake which generated the size of loss which was well above $10 billion, which nobody really thought was that plausible before it actually happened. It's basically the ratio of the losses to the premiums. And in fact, this is shown here in the slide here, where I've got the basic statistics on what the premiums earned were. That from 1971 to 1994, insurance companies only collected $3.5 billion in premiums. But after the North Ridge earthquake, they had to pay out almost 5 times that much, i.e. that just one earthquake wiped out all the premiums they earned over several decades. Which is to say that using a short period of time in terms of historical experience is really a poor basis for underwriting risk, when the return period for events which could happen could be in hundreds, if not many hundreds of years. So it's clear that a fundamental principle which we can understand in catastrophe risk is that you can't make too much out of any finite period of data. And in terms of the financial markets, this was echoed in analysis done by the Office of Financial Research in Washington, D.C., where if you just look at the basic premise, which has been commonplace, which is this kind of equilibrium statement that's the probabilities of a market state as it returns the state variables and a certain variable for a systemic event. This doesn't depend on that. This can be translated over time that this assumption this assumption is clearly at fault, and it's one of the reasons why we need to do something better than just looking at the historical data just on its own. So in this respect, what I'd like to do is just to talk about counterfactual disaster history. We tend to regard disasters as being fixed in time. So if we think of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, that we think, well, it was in 1906, and it wasn't in 1907 or 1904 or 1910 or 1920. But it could have been. It could have been either earlier or later. It's just a matter of luck that it occurred in 1906. So some points about disaster history. First of all, catastrophes are extreme events. History is a vital data resource because catastrophes are rare. Much can be gleaned from a detailed study of near misses, catastrophes that might have been. The previous speakers mentioned the 1993 World Trade Center attack. What insurers tend to do is to take losses at face value. That was not a catastrophe loss because fortunately the actual intention of the terrorists then was just to destabilize one of the twin towers to fall on the other. That never happened, but hypothetically it could have happened. There is a writer of counterfactual fiction by the name of Philip Roth, and here's this quote which I like and is relevant to catastrophe risk modeling, which is that the terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides. So if you look at the history of losses, and as I mentioned, the 1993 World Trade Center attack, if you don't see any big losses in history, it doesn't mean to say that they aren't lurking there, ready to hit you at some future time. So it's these events which almost happened, which are hidden in history. So this is the significance of this sentence here. The terror of the unforeseen is what the science of history hides. On the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I attended a meeting at the British Academy in London, and the opening address was given by a professor of international relations, who recounted this story that on that fateful day of 9/11, he was watching these horrific scenes of the destruction of the Twin Towers unfold, and he was watching this in the company of his 5-year-old daughter. And what the professor said was this, that as his daughter was watching the destruction of the Twin Towers, his daughter asked him a question. Now, some of you here must have young children of that kind of age, sort of about 5 years or have had children of that age. And so you can just think what kind of question would be an interesting question for a 5-year-old to ask. Someone who'd only had 5 years of knowledge of the ways of the world, seeing the destruction of these iconic buildings. And the question that this 5-year-old girl asked was this: why didn't this happen before? Why didn't this happen before? And the answer to that question is, it could have happened before. And you can say this about any type of catastrophe. Why didn't this happen before? It's a very good question to ask. Why didn't this happen before? There's the Eiffel Tower there. 2 years before this girl was born, in 1994, so she had no memory of this whatsoever, 2 years before she was born, there was an attempted attack on the Eiffel Tower, the idea being to fly a plane into the Eiffel Tower. This is by the Algerian terrorist organization, the GIA. Fortunately, their plane was stopped in Marseille, and the French commanders dealt with the terrorists. But that was the plan, to fly a plane into the Eiffel Tower. If that plan exceeded, there'd only be historical photographs of the Eiffel Tower, and almost certainly the Twin Towers would still be standing. Now, I mention this about counterfactual disaster analysis because I recently had an interesting conversation with a trader who's based in Singapore, a very successful trader who actually doubled his investors' money during the great financial crash. And he said he made some money for himself, which I can well believe. And he said he'd recent meeting with Jean-Claude Trichet of the European Bank. And Monsieur Trichet had the idea that if you just take what happened to long-term capital management, his idea was that maybe if long-term capital management had actually failed, supposing the Wall Street banks hadn't got together to rescue LTCM, then maybe the great crash last few years might not have happened. It's the same kind of idea, okay, that you get inoculated against disasters if something bad really happens. So if the GIA had succeeded in hitting the Eiffel Tower in 1994, then the World Trade Center would almost certainly still be standing, and also there wouldn't have been the huge terrorism insurance loss on 9/11 itself. Okay, more on counterfactuals. Just a year ago, we had the meteorite strike on Chelyabinsk in Russia. The town of Chelyabinsk has a huge population of more than 1 million. Fortunately, the meteorite didn't land on the town; it landed in a lake. But this was the largest impact by an asteroid since Tunguska in 1908. That was a stroke of luck for the insurance industry. Just 2 years ago, there was the sinking of the Costa Concordia. This event took place on the 13th of January 2012. When news of the sinking first happened, I was watching the BBC News, and they brought in this maritime expert for him to give his views on what had happened. And of course, with the modern GPS systems, it's hard to understand how it can happen. How can it happen that a ship like this can be sunk by rocks? And this maritime expert's explanation was quite simple. An earthquake must have happened, which had moved the rocks in the path of the ship. That's what he said. And I said to myself, I don't think so. But I think this must have happened almost before. I thought there must have been some near misses like this before. And indeed, that was exactly the case, because there was a tradition for this vessel to sail on the safety margin, to go off course and sail close to the island of Giglio, to give the islanders a good view and give the passengers something to wave at. Okay, and this happened a number of times, especially around the feast of San Lorenzo on the 10th of August. And for insurers amongst you, this was an expensive history, because the actual over-insurance loss right now stands at around $2 billion with the extremely high salvage costs and so on. But hypothetically, if someone had actually taken the trouble to analyze the route of the Costa Concordia, they could have figured out that it was only just a matter of time before the skipper's luck ran out, as it indeed it did 2 years ago. Moving on to just a kind of conceptual framework for this. There's an old Chinese proverb, which is prophesying is always difficult, especially about the past. Especially about the past. The past, my background is in theoretical physics, and for me, history is just one realization of what could happen. There's nothing special about history. History didn't have to be the way it was. Okay, so with that perspective, you can think of doing some stochastic modeling, not of the future, but of the past. So in particular, if you take any particular peril that you're interested in, you could follow the trajectory of what happened, and you can do some simulation as to how things could have been different. So for example, you could take the World Trade Center in 1993 and say, well, supposing that Ramzi Youssef, the terrorist who masterminded that, had been a bit smarter in the amount of explosive he used, then perhaps the Twin Towers, one of the Twin Towers could have collapsed, and that would have been a massive insurance loss. Okay, so the fact that the fact that the terrorism insurance market never really changed after 1993 is partly a reflection that people didn't do this kind of stochastic modeling of the past. That for any event you can analyze what happened, but also what didn't happen, and learn lessons from that. There's a great book by Reinhardt and Rogoff on the history of financial catastrophes called "This Time is Different," and you can say the same for any kind of natural hazard as well. That this time is different. That we're not going to get the same losses we had in the past, it's very salutary just to reflect on the history of these financial disasters. And also my last point there, which is that doing a counterfactual analysis of the averted financial crisis would be instructive. So if you take the failure of long-term capital management, that doing an analysis of that whole crisis situation, just to try to understand how it could have worked out differently, would, in my view, be instructive. I should say that with regard to the more recent financial crisis, it's well known that the demise of Lehman Brothers was preceded by sort of haggling as to whether Barclays Bank would take over some of the liabilities of Lehman Brothers. And it was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, Alistair Darling, who vetoed it, saying that he couldn't let the British taxpayer be on the hook for those liabilities. I happened to listen to Alistair Darling talking in person at an actuarial conference last November, and I must say that what one wonders about politicians is the degree to which their decision-making is influenced unduly by their own reputation as opposed to the national need. Sticking with the terrorism theme, I'm showing you here 30, a histogram showing 30 V30 plots since 9/11, which involved a courtroom conviction, and so where there is objective evidence that these were indeed plots. And for each of these plots, it's possible to estimate a counterfactual probability or likelihood that these particular plots could have turned out to cause actual loss. And we see at the top there, the ones which had the highest likelihood, we had the Shuja bomber of Richard Reed, the underpants bomber Abdul Muttalib, and the Times Square bomber Faisal Shahzad, and working all the way down to a plot to assassinate President Bush. A key point about this plot is that the reason why there wasn't a successful plot in the decade after 9/11 is to a large extent due to counterterrorism measures, in particular sort of highly intrusive surveillance measures, which Edward Snowden has spilt the beans about in recent months. There is a trade-off between keeping the public safe and some erosion of civil liberties in connection with counterterrorism operations. In fact, following the London bombings of 2005, the Director General of MI5, Eliza Manningham-Buller, gave a speech in The Hague in which she said that there needs to be a debate on whether some erosion of what we all value may be necessary to improve the chances of our citizens not being blown apart as they go about their daily lives. And what I suggest is that if you just take this parallel with counterterrorism, that with regard to avoiding future financial catastrophes, then some rebalancing may be desirable in terms of the amount of information which is available to the regulators so that they can understand the market more precisely. And already, this is from an Office of Financial Research working paper, that they're advocating doing analyses of the system under counterfactual conditions, and the more analysis of this, the better. And moving on to the insurance context, I'd like to talk about the situation which arose in the insurance markets in the 1980s, which was in some ways a precursor to the debacle in the financial markets in more recent years. We had a situation where in 1983, Hurricane Alicia turned up to hit the United States mainland. Rather unfortunately for understanding of the market, this hurricane occurred after a huge gap of 3 years before the previous hurricane occurred. So in terms of market development, you had a situation where new members were very pleased to add their names to Lloyd's syndicates, and obviously year in, year out, they didn't see any losses. In fact, they didn't even see any hurricanes, so they thought this was a pretty good business to be in. There was a mention of the reinsurance spiral which happened. This is a bit more detail about what exactly happened. Again, there's no corrective on this market because there were no hurricanes, and so there was this game of pass the parcel which was played, which everyone seemed to be the winner of because there were no losses. and so it's like a sort of parlor game. But all sorts of ugly things happen. So the most bizarre occurred with the fire explosion on the Piper Alpha platform in the North Sea in July 1988, where nominal losses of $1 billion have turned into overall reinsured losses of 30 billion, and this was again through sort of multiple passing of the risk over and over again. Some of the practices are reminiscent of some of the excesses in the financial crash of the last decade, namely that we have a situation where there were misaligned incentives for the deal makers who spread the risk. There was an overabundance of new capital. Again, there are no losses to sort of warn investors of what the real risks were. So this was a paper published in 2009, and if this kind of learning had spread from the reinsurance markets to the capital markets, then people might have been better forewarned. With regard to financial disclosure regulation, again, this comes from the Office of Financial Research. We have the statement that the origin of systemic events comes from liquidity, leverage, losses, and linkages. And they suggest that data encryption algorithms may permit regulators to compute systemic risk exposures without individual institutions needing to reveal proprietary data. Coming back to my reference to counterterrorism, what has helped keep terrorism insurance losses down to minimal levels since 9/11 has been information which is gathered by the intelligence and security services about the plotting going on. And one could argue that with regard to the financial markets, that if more information about trading within the major institutions, if more information were available to the regulator, then that would have a productive effect on mitigating the risk of another financial crash. I'd just like to make a comment about the asymmetry in regulatory errors. Again, it's a point which the Office of Financial Research has made, namely that if you're a regulator, we have the standard two types of error. You have the type 1 error, the false positives, where a regulator prematurely closes down a financial institution, or the type 2 error, where the regulator just waits until a financial institution defaults and then just says, well, I thought it was going to default, but I wasn't sure, so I didn't step in. The problem with being a financial regulator is that there's a high prospect that they could be sued for premature closure of a solvent firm. Whereas if you act late and don't do anything, then as an individual, you're less likely to be penalized. With some reference to the previous talk, for those who argue that we can rely on the market to self-manage itself, I would just rely on the people who work in the markets to make sure that they stay solvent and don't go insolvent. And one has to bear in mind that, in a way, this is the basic principle, perhaps or the most important principle that one needs to remember with regard to market behavior, namely that all actions start out with thoughts which are intermediated by feelings. Okay, so you think that it's just thoughts, but they're feelings as well. And everyone has their own favorite example of excesses during the financial crash. This is one of my favorite examples, which I heard directly from a UBS trader in terms of the asymmetry of collective risk and personal reward, which was that in the summer of 2007, there was a $10 billion trade which was urgently executed so that the traders could mark up a $30 million profit to add to their bonus pool. And 16 months later, this trade was marked down to $2 billion. Okay, so now this is not a historical freak. Basically, this could happen tomorrow. I mean, essentially, when it comes down to people acting in their own self-interest, then one can expect this kind of behavior to be replicated unless there's some regulatory intervention. Now, I'd like to contrast that with what happens on the counter-terrorism side, where if you consider the type 1 and type 2 errors, that the type 1 error would be prematurely arresting a terrorist suspect and keeping him interrogated, perhaps in a cell for a few days or whatever, as opposed to the type 2 error of waiting until an attack has taken place. And it's well known, in fact, in all the countries of the Western Alliance, that there's been a very heavy emphasis on avoiding type 2 errors. Okay, that the security services just do not want any terrorist to move towards his point of attack. If they have to arrest a lot of innocent people, that's fine, but they just do not want to let terrorists get away and kill people. In fact, regarding the use of information, this is a quote from T.S. Eliot's sort of wonderful poem, The Rock, which is, I mention this because this is a quote which is often quoted by MI5, the British Security Service. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? And I think this is a wonderful quote, which anyone who works in any kind of catastrophe domain could do with reflecting on. Let's move on to other types of catastrophe. It helps to be a billionaire like Mayor Michael Bloomberg, because when he was mayor of New York, he mandated the evacuation of 370,000 New Yorkers in successive years in 2011 and 2012. In 2011, it was essentially a false alarm because the actual level of the storm surge didn't actually cause the subways to be flooded, which was not the case in 2012. After 2011, some local businesses did threaten to sue the city because of this evacuation, but then Michael Bloomberg was wealthy enough to have been able to afford the best lawyers, so that kind of lawsuit never happened. Now, I mentioned Michael Bloomberg because when it comes to the financial markets, a different type of norm seems to prevail. So if you just take Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, Bernie Madoff himself has told the New York Times that the big banks and hedge funds had to know about his Ponzi scheme. And in fact, Mayor Bloomberg, in an interview with ABC News, said that he knew Bernie Madoff 20 years ago, and he was a nice guy back then. But the key thing about this recollection is that whereas with regard to the hurricane, that Mayor Bloomberg was happy to take affirmative action to try to save New Yorkers from harm and loss, that when it comes to this kind of financial market, that he wasn't sure that Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme, and the rest is history. In fact, there's a mathematics of Ponzi schemes, which in fact shows that if the inflow is in the sweet spot, these Ponzi schemes can actually run for a long time. So the inflow can't be either too large or too small, and that's exactly what Bernie Madoff did. And of course, also another Ponzi schemer of recent times, Alan Stanford in Antigua, managed to pull off a similarly grotesque Ponzi scheme fraud, $7 billion over 20 years. And there was some complicity in the Antigua government, in as much as they received $90 million in loans which were not repaid. Now, in terms of risk and reward, I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that there are some industries where affirmative action to try to protect the public is really highly commendable. And this is the example given from the domain of the licensing of pharmaceuticals. In 1960, this American heroine, Frances Kelsey, who was a doctor, and she just started working at the FDA, her first task as a rookie in this department was to assess whether the drug thalidomide, which is used for morning sickness of pregnant women, whether this could be licensed in America because it had been licensed in Europe. And in fact, she said no. She wasn't happy with the data provided by the pharmaceutical company about the safety of the drug, and the drug company put a lot of pressure on the FDA about this, and of course she turned out to be correct. So she actually exposed herself to a lot of personal risk for the sake of the general public. So this brings me on to the slide here, which is that you ask the question, who gets the reward and who takes the risk? We have individuals who take on personal risk for substantial societal reward. We have class B, individuals who take on personal risk for substantial individual as well as societal reward, and individuals who subject others to substantial risk for their own personal reward. And there are people in all these three classes, but in a meeting I had with Andy Haldane, the Director of Financial Security at the Bank of England, I suggested to him that at the Bank of England there should be a governor's medal instituted for regulators at the Bank of England who are prepared to take on financial institutions for the better good of society. Now I'm going to move on to some more issues to do with exactly what can be done with regards to the development of financial crisis. So Didier Sornette showed this kind of curve which is the kind of lead up to some kind of singular point. In fact, this particular, so the arrow there is an exponent. This particular example is actually relevant to volcano risk because the actual mathematics of the lead up to volcanic eruption have some similarities with the lead up to financial crashes. And the problem for volcano observatories is that you have no control over the development of the volcano risk. But what you have in your own hands is a decision as to whether to call evacuation or not. And this does depend on what is the perceived likelihood of an eruption taking place. With man-made hazards, they are subject to control, so that there are measures that financial regulators can take to try to do something about a perceived unstable situation arising. And I'll have a few more comments to make about that as we go along. I'd just like to say, with regard to comparing financial data analysis with natural hazards, that doing an analysis of a statistical analysis of data on certain financial instruments is not the answer. I recently went to a meeting of the National Association of Insurance Commissioners in America, and I was horrified to hear a spokesperson from PIMCO, the largest bondholders in the world, who were talking about the trading of mortgage-backed securities, where the analysis of the risk was just based on a short length of historical data of trading, which is essentially what we're talking about in the top line there. And for someone who works in natural hazards like myself, that is no more meaningful than doing analysis of earthquake loss data in Japan before the great earthquake of March 2011. So in terms of what can be done about it, there are a number of ideas around. One which seems to make sense to me, at least, is the idea that institutions should pay for the externality imposed on the overall system. So if a certain institution threaten the stability of the market in general, then there's a case to be made that they should be prepared to pay to mitigate that particular risk. There's some reference earlier on. I think Didier talked about resilience, and I'd just like to make some comments about the whole idea of resilience in the financial markets. The first point is that there is a whole field of resilience engineering. This is a book just devoted to this subject. Resilience engineering is not about the reliability of individual components, but it's really about understanding and facilitating a system's ability to ensure that things do not get out of control, that they do not get out of control. And we can all learn about the way that these challenges of preventing systems from not getting out of control, we can all learn from the way that people in other disciplines and fields address this particular problem. As a physicist, one of my heroes as a student was James Clerk Maxwell, who might be called the British Einstein. And he was the first person to do an analysis of the instability of the governor of a steam engine. This was back in the 19th century, as the steam engine moves, the balls here on this governor raise up. This causes this throttle to close down somewhat so as to regulate the speed. So that's the whole principle of the governor. But Maxwell's the first person to point out that there are instabilities in this system, so that if you have too tight control of the this whole governor system, then you'll get an oscillation in the overall speed of the engine, which is not what anyone wants. So Maxwell was the first person to point this out, and I know that this example has been referred to in various publications on the financial markets as an analogy. In terms of resilience, again, we can all learn from the best examples from other fields. There was a paper published in Nature last year highlighting the fact that the F-15 jet has remarkable capabilities of resilience, and that lessons from the way that the F-15 manages to keep in the air, that these lessons can be brought across to helping electrical power grids become more resilient against blackouts, which is quite an interesting parallel. And in fact, if you just consider resilience as a topic in its own right, I don't know what examples that you here may have in terms of a kind of wow factor for resilience, but the one which stands out to my mind is the case of an F-15, which was flown by this Israeli pilot in 1983. It collided with a Skyhawk trainer aircraft, and one wing was torn off. Yeah, indeed. And amazingly, he managed to land the plane without injury to himself. And that was an astonishing feat of airmanship, because he had to fly at exactly the right speed and with the right controls just to keep the plane from flipping over and so on. But he actually managed to do this. A really extraordinary feat of resilience. A plane was the wing of the plane was torn off, but the pilot managed to regain control and land safely. Now, this is a kind of example really to inspire those who are involved in financial regulation, that we want a kind of financial system such that if something terrible really does happen, that you can have a soft landing. Everyone talks about having a soft landing for the economy, but we want this kind of soft landing, not one where the wing gets torn off and that the pilot ejects and the damaged plane lands on a town and kills 100 people on the ground, which is a kind of metaphor for what's happened in the financial crisis. So this is the kind of resilience we want, where if something really bad happens, that it's possible to take extraordinary measures, and in particular some very skillful measures, to control the situation, have a soft landing, okay, so that the actual suffering is mitigated. So this is my last slide, which is just some comments about the regulatory control of systemic risk. Is that first point is regulation is key to the control of man-made catastrophes. So if you just take terrorism risk, for example, there have been many attempts to attack the countries of the Western Alliance since 9/11. There have only been 3 successes: Madrid in 2004, London in 2005, and Boston in 2013. And that's due to fantastic regulation and control of terrorism through the security services. So regulation can do a lot to control man-made catastrophes. The regulators need to have access to sufficient information to assess systemic risk adequately. Edward Snowden has told us about the surveillance information which the counterterrorism authorities have in order to control terrorism risk. And with regard to the financial markets, more information needs to be made available to the regulator to enable them to have a better understanding of the market as a whole. This may come at some cost in data privacy and confidentiality. There's always this argument that people are entitled to live their own lives without interference from the state. Well, that's true up to a point. With regard to terrorism risk, this balance is heavily weighted towards keeping people safe on the streets rather than protecting the rights of individuals. So this is something that needs to be thought about in connection with financial regulation. And also, it's my last point here, which is that regulators need to be incentivized to intervene earlier to prevent financial instability. The way things are at the moment, regulators are incentivized not to intervene early because there are the prospects of being sued by the financial institution they're dealing with, and so on. The balance needs to be corrected so that the regulators are given more an incentive really to be able to clamp down on institutions which are putting the whole system at risk. So this is a lesson in a way which has been learned from other domains of man-made hazard, which really spill over to the financial markets. So I'm going to stop my talk there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take a few questions.
Gordon, thank you for another great talk. I just have one question or comment. I know you quoted a study by O'Neill from Reinsurance talking about excess of loss covers in the London market. And given that we're sort of practitioners from the London market are probably in minority here, I'm wondering how a relatively benign instrument of risk transfer made it on the list with all the other nasties like Al-Qaeda, Bernie Madoff, and financial crashes. So if you can maybe put some more light on that.
Well, because that's for a reason, because there's Amlin, which is, that obviously this talk is meant to bring obviously the insurance world into this discussion about the financial markets. But the reason for showing those slides was simply that there are lessons to be learned from that whole debacle. I mean, what happened there has not been repeated since. And I should say, in defense of catastrophe risk modelling, that happened in the early 1980s, which was at least 5 years before catastrophe modelling started, right? And in fact, it would be unthinkable for anything like that to get out of control in the current time, simply because you'd be modelling all these different types of transactions. It'd be plain as day that this kind of horrific situation was being developed. But I should say that in the context of the lessons we learned from that, it's clear that more than anything else, what was needed was a proper understanding of exactly what these trades were. Okay, and so and that needs documentation, and that kind of information, should be available to the managers of that particular financial institution, but they should also be made available to the market. So obviously, for the Lloyd's, for Lloyd's syndicate now, then of course the regulators at Lloyd's who would be watching over this kind of development. But the basic lesson, which is that it's just crazy to allow this kind of system of trading to go on without people having any idea what's going on. Okay, so I say that the first step for any financial regulator is to have a good understanding of what trading is going on. Okay, I know Hank Paulson, when he's trying to stem the tide of the financial crisis, obviously had this terrible problem that he only had a small insight into what was going on, and that's due to partly to the problem of lack of information. So, but I do think it's a good paradigm for this audience. Thank you, Milan.
Thanks, Gordon. To build on that question and to come back to your 4 concrete points at the end, you said this is what we should be doing to avoid systemic risk. What would have actually been different if this had been in place? How would the regulators have actually intervened to stop the financial crisis?
Well, thank you very much for asking that kind of question, because this relates directly to the first part of my talk, which was to encourage people to do counterfactual analysis of past crises. Okay, so people want to play this kind of board game of going back to these financial crises and say, look, supposing that we'd had these points in place at the time, how would things have been different? Okay, and you can go back to past crises like
like the failure of LTCM and so on. For a whole series of crises, you can also, supposing we had different regulatory powers in place at that time, how could things have played out differently? So I think these very, so I should say that the whole concept of counterfactual history is somewhat controversial, namely because I think historians, except those who are Anglo-Saxon, hate the idea of presuming history to be other than what it actually was. But I think, for anyone who works in catastrophe risk, it's so insightful just to go back to previous events and say, look, supposing that well, just take this point about supposing regulators have been incentivized to intervene early, that at what stage could someone reasonably have intervened to stop? So if you just take the case in Britain with Northern Rock, for example, which obviously was the first building society stroke bank to fail. At what stage could someone have intervened then? In fact, I heard a story that two regulators from the Financial Regulatory Authority paid a visit to Northern Rock at their offices in the North England. They turned up. The person they went to meet didn't turn up, and they just went away. They just went back to London. That was it. Okay, I mean, it just shows the kind of problems that existed at the time. Okay, that the regulators needed to be. There should have been some incentive to intervene. I mean, turning up and going away reflects a state of disincentivization, where if you report anything which is negative towards Northern Rock, that could be a black mark in your career as a regulator. So if you turned up and nobody showed up, that's good news. You can't say that anybody said anything to you. You were not given any information which cast any doubt on their solvency. That's actually good news. So they must be very pleased. They turned up, had a cup of coffee, went back on the train to London, and reporting said, we didn't hear anything which was untoward. That's what they could have just, and it comes back to incentivization. People need to be incentivized to identify potential risks to the system. And that did not exist at the time, but it could have done.
Yeah, I like very much the counterfactual approach. However, I think there is a lot of naivety in this. I tried to argue this morning that the crisis came out of really a systemic 30-year maturation, and whatever level of incentive would have had to go to the depths, to the roots of all of society, which were feeling so rich for 30 years. So this is really like trying to solve a flood, like the flood in Japan, with just little cups to take out the problem. More specifically, the LTCM issue that you were suggesting with the analogy with the Eiffel Tower could have led to something different. But if you look into the detailed understanding of the development of the crisis, you immediately recognize that this could not be done simply because the banks which bailed out LTCM did not do it just for being good guys or good citizens. They had skin in the game, and that was a way actually to avoid a lot of loss from themselves, for their own pocket. It was not just to save systemically the system, it's just to save. So we can run these counterfactuals, but we have to run them with all the relevant information. So that's also, I was surprised, just another comment, you mentioned the OFR, US OFR research emphasizing liquidity, leverage, losses, and linkage as the 4 key elements before systemic crisis. And I'm amazed that they don't mention depth. And I would like to refer to the book Depth, the first 5,000 years, by the anthropologist David Graeber, that shows actually in all societies, always the problem is depth. So it's a very, short-sighted and myopic from the OFR. And lastly, running counterfactuals. I don't know if you know the what-if series of historians who run this, and as a physicist or a dynamicist, I share your view of looking at series one pass, but I look at it not as a random walk, but as a dynamical system which is very hard to predict like chaos. But there are also coherent structures, there are pockets of predictability, there are bottlenecks. So indeed, when you look at the history, for example, of this what-if scenario that historians have tried to really do it in a kind of quasi-scientific way, you find that there are points where there are instabilities, like critical point, bifurcation, and so on, but also phases which are much more stable, solidification. So I think I would love to see the development of a science of counterfactuals, of, I would say, including comparative history, to actually not put all the garbage in the, thinking that everything is not predictable. I've tried to make a big message this morning that actually we are mistaken when we think that nothing is predictable if we focus on some pockets, on some times when there is actually better than just randomness.
Okay, well, thank you, Didier. The first point I'd like to make, actually, which is for the benefit of all insurers here in the audience, is that the insurance industry is very bad at taking seriously risks which have not given rise to significant losses in the past. And the merit of kind of counterfactual analysis is precisely that, the fact that if you take an event like 1993 World Trade Center, okay, that it doesn't take a lot of engineering analysis to figure out under what conditions the building could have suffered much more serious damage than it actually did, and might even toppled over. So it was actually possible to do this. And my point is this, Didier, which is that, and again, referring back to LTCM, which is that if you have any kind of hazard situation where if you do some kind of counterfactual analysis, you could turn that event from being essentially minimal loss to one where you could have had at least some moderate loss, even if it's not a catastrophe loss. That in itself inoculates the insurance market to take it seriously. Okay. In other words, it would have a big impact on the insurance market if you did this kind of analysis. But if I just give you an example of cyber risk. Okay, cyber risk is a risk where, as I speak now, there have not been any substantial cyber risk insurance losses. Okay, RMS had a seminar in New York City 2 years ago, which featured cyber risks. We had one of the world's leading cyber experts giving a talk, who gave lots of examples of how some major reinsurance losses could occur through this. But afterwards, it was very hard to get people really excited about it, simply because they haven't seen any losses. You know, it doesn't matter how many times people say you could get this loss, or that if they haven't seen anything. Okay, whereas the point I'm making is that if you just go back to some other events, I mean, if you take cyber risk, there's a famous case of the Configure worm of a few years ago, which eventually was tamed and didn't cause a big loss. But the merit of doing counterfactual analysis is you can take some historical events which happen, and you could just ask some of these what-if questions. And if some of these what-if questions lead to some significant level of insurance loss, then that's a way of concentrating people's minds that this is something which could be real. Okay, I mean, so if you just take the cost of Concordia, which is that especially these soft markets where the insurers find it very hard to be able to sustain losses of that kind, given the premium income and so on, that they're doing this kind of analysis just to explore what kind of variability could have arisen is very useful. I should say that people are used to doing this for the future, so you can consider some future scenario of, say, some of the giant cruise ships built in Norway, for example, and people do analysis of what kind of situation there might be sinking in one of these cruise ships. So people do this for the future, but it's not really done for the past. Taking Costa Concordia and revisiting it, and just knowing what we know about the fact that it sailed on the safety margin as a matter of practice, then clearly with that kind of captaincy, then the vessel was always prone to his number two misinterpreting his instruction. So as I understand it, Captain Schettino instructed his number two to turn in a certain direction. He turned in the opposite direction, which turned out to be on the rock. So I just mentioned this just as an example of how this kind of analysis of the past could help give insurers a better feeling for the fact that some major losses could happen even if they haven't been observed in the past. If I just, the last example I'd like to give is actually on aviation risk, because I once was a safety consultant for British Airways, which is why I always fly British Airways if I can. There's a case where a pilot took off at the old Hong Kong airport and turned in the wrong direction. And for any of you who know the old Hong Kong airport, that's not a good thing to do, because there's a mountain in the way. Okay, fortunately, there's no crash. But the point about aviation is that the aviation market traditionally has always been very soft as an insurance market. I remember once when I was working in the Guy Carpenter building in London, I used to bump into these aviation brokers from time to time, and I used to tell them, look, do you realize how many near misses there are on this airline? And all they worried about were the crashes. They didn't have any crashes. No crashes, no loss. You know, so they just looked at their loss experience. Okay, and I said, well, do you realize that all these, if I just quote, the Concorde, because the Concorde was referred to earlier. The Concorde, I mean, I always thought to myself that £10,000 was a lot of money to pay for a near-death experience, given the number of near misses that the Concorde had before it finally had its demise at Paris Airport. So I just mention this because I think for insurers, this whole idea of not just taking your loss history at face value, but working at it, sort of pulling it and twisting it and seeing under what circumstances your losses could have changed, that this would be a very instructive experience.
Okay, thank you very much. We have no time for further questions right now, but we'll have a break for 30 minutes and there'll be refreshments, and then we'll return here at 4 o'clock for Doyne Farmer and Lord Robert May.